Everyone thinks rationing was about fairness, about every family getting its equal share of butter, sugar, and gasoline while the boys were fighting overseas. The posters said, "Do with less so they'll have enough." The truth? Some of the biggest fortunes of the 20th century were built not despite rationing, but because of it. Look at the image: lines outside butcher shops, mothers counting stamps, headlines warning of shortages. Behind that, in the boardrooms of New York, London, and Chicago, contracts worth billions were being signed. Every limit on civilian consumption became a guarantee of profit for someone else, because the economy of scarcity is never truly scarce for those who own the supply chains. It wasn't chaos, it was design. The same rationing boards that told you how much meat you could buy were coordinating directly with companies like General Motors, Standard Oil, DuPont, and Kellogg's. Officially, these firms were supporting the war effort. In reality, they were securing monopolies that would outlast the war by decades. When the Office of Price Administration fixed prices for citizens, it also fixed contracts for corporations, long-term deals with margins shielded from market risk. War turned competition into coordination. Consider DuPont, once branded the merchant of death after World War I for its weapons profits. By 1942, it had repositioned itself as a patriotic chemist. Nylon, once a luxury for women's stockings, was redirected entirely to parachutes. The company lost no revenue because the government paid for every fiber. The slogan of the home front, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without," didn't apply in Wilmington, Delaware. The same with Standard Oil of New Jersey. Officially, it was helping fuel the Allies. Quietly, its patents with IG Farben in Germany remained active through Swiss intermediaries. Rationing created an illusion of shared sacrifice, but the global oil trade kept flowing through neutral ports, and profits flowed with it. That's the paradox. When citizens were told consumption was unpatriotic, corporations were told the opposite: produce more, charge the state, expand your capacity. Rationing didn't shrink the economy, it centralized it. It made the government the single largest customer in history, and the industrial giants its chosen suppliers. This was not just about food or fuel. It was about the birth of a system we still live under, where crises become contracts and scarcity becomes a business model. When money and production are controlled through quotas and coupons, someone always holds the printing press. And in 1942, that someone wasn't the citizen with the ration book. It was the corporation with the government signature. If this changes the way you picture the home front, let it sink in. Rationing wasn't just about saving. It was about reallocating power, profit, and control. To understand how companies got rich from rationing, we have to strip away the posters and slogans and look at the machinery underneath, the system that was built between 1942 and 1945, piece by piece, like an industrial cathedral of control. When the U.S. entered the war in December 1941, Washington faced a simple arithmetic problem. The economy could not serve both the front and the home. The factories, the steel, the oil, the rubber, all finite. So the Roosevelt administration created a web of new agencies to command what used to be a market: the War Production Board, the Office of Price Administration, OPA, the Office of War Mobilization. On paper, these were public bodies. In practice, they were staffed by the same men who had run the largest corporations before the war and who would return to them afterward. Donald Nelson, head of the War Production Board, came directly from Sears Roebuck and Company. William Knudsen, appointed to coordinate war production, was a former president of General Motors. Their logic was industrial. The fastest way to manage scarcity was to turn government into a corporate client. Instead of letting hundreds of companies compete for supply and price, Washington would guarantee orders to a select few, fix their profit margins, and pay for expansion with public money. That's how DuPont, General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, and Alcoa became extensions of the state. Each ration coupon given to a citizen corresponded to a bulk contract given to industry. If the government limited the sale of gasoline to the average driver, it was only because it was purchasing billions of gallons from Standard Oil for military convoys. Every restriction on the public created a certainty for private suppliers. scarcity on one end, stability on the other. The mechanism ran on two levers, quotas and credits. Quotas determined what and how much could be produced. Credits determined who got to finance it. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a kind of government bank, issued loans directly to corporations to expand war capacity. Between 1940 and 1945, it lent over $20 billion, much of it never repaid in full because the plants it financed were considered national assets. In reality, after 1945, those same assets were sold back to private owners at a fraction of cost. The taxpayer built the factories, the corporations kept them. Britain followed the same model. The Ministry of Supply took control of steel and textiles, but contracts flowed through the old imperial giants, Unilever, Imperial Chemical Industries, Vickers. London rationed soap, but Unilever's profits rose because it supplied the entire empire's military hygiene needs. The illusion of equality masked a new hierarchy of dependency. Citizens with coupons, companies with contracts, both bound to the state, but only one side collecting dividends. The public heard about sacrifice. The insiders saw security. When the OPA froze wages for the duration of the emergency, corporate revenues were simultaneously guaranteed by cost-plus contracts, meaning the more they spent, the more they earned. It was risk-free capitalism, shielded by patriotism. The same formula would later define the Cold War, Vietnam, and even pandemic economies. When risk is socialized and reward is privatized, crisis becomes the most reliable business cycle. From the outside, rationing looked moral. From the inside, it was mechanical. A perfect feedback loop of fear and profit. The more the government warned of shortages, the more control it gained over production. The more control it gained, the more indispensable its suppliers became. It was not the free market that won the war. It was the planned market, run by those who used to own it. And once a system like that is built, it never truly disappears. It waits for the next emergency, the next decree, the next temporary measure that becomes permanent. If this revealed the architecture behind rationing, tell me in the comments. Do you think control begins with crisis, or crisis begins with control? By 1943, the system seemed flawless. Production was at record highs, unemployment was nearly zero, and newspapers called it the miracle of mobilization. To most citizens, rationing looked like proof that America could manage its economy without chaos, that planned scarcity could coexist with prosperity. People were working, soldiers were supplied, and victory seemed only a matter of time. The illusion was complete. You'd walk into a grocery store and see half-empty shelves, but outside, factories ran day and night. Planes, tanks, synthetic rubber, canned goods, the output was staggering. Every number in the books said growth. But this was not growth born from competition or innovation. It was growth born from guarantees. Every contract had a buyer before it had a product. Every loan had repayment assured by the Treasury. The risk had been removed, not abolished, just transferred from the balance sheets of companies to the pockets of citizens. This was when the idea of total war economy became intoxicating. Economists and corporate planners began to wonder, if the state can direct production so efficiently during war, why ever return to the chaos of the market? Publications like Fortune and Businessweek ran optimistic stories about a permanent war prosperity. Politicians called it a model for post-war reconstruction. What they didn't say was that it relied entirely on a continuous state of emergency, a nation addicted to mobilization. The illusion had two faces. For the worker, rationing and full employment looked like social justice. For the industrialist, it looked like a shield against downturns. The worker received stable wages but could buy little. The company earned unlimited revenues but faced no competition. It was a soft nationalization of demand and a hard privatization of profit. Everyone seemed happy because no one saw the full picture. The American middle class, born in these very years, believed its security came from productivity. In truth, it came from controlled distribution. A family's income meant little when all major goods were rationed by government decree. What people didn't earn, they were given, in coupons, stamps, and patriotic slogans. Consumption became moralized, eating less, driving less, saving more, all framed as virtue. The war machine didn't just regulate the economy, it reprogrammed public behavior. And companies understood that better than anyone. Coca-Cola, exempted from sugar rationing under direct orders from the War Department, expanded into Europe with military logistics. Every bottle sold to soldiers abroad was a government shipment. By 1945, Coca-Cola had built dozens of bottling plants across liberated Europe, infrastructure that would serve its global domination long after peace returned. The same pattern repeated with Ford, IBM, and DuPont. Their global footprints were financed by rationing at home. It felt righteous, but it was arithmetic dressed as morality. For every unit of sacrifice demanded of civilians, there was an equal and opposite credit in corporate ledgers. Scarcity became the language of unity, but its grammar spelled monopoly. By 1944, as D-Day was planned and Allied victory loomed, the system reached its zenith. The economy seemed unstoppable, yet it was entirely dependent on centralized spending, fixed prices, and endless borrowing. Washington printed what it could not tax, industry billed what it could not risk, citizens obeyed what they could not question. It worked, but only as long as the war did. Arithmetic, however, has no ideology. The moment the guns stopped, the equations would change, and everyone would discover that the miracle had been sustained by a single illusion, that planned scarcity could coexist with unlimited growth. If this made you rethink what war prosperity really meant, write in the comments. Do you think we ever left that system, or are we still living in its shadow? When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the math no longer worked. The war economy, this vast machine of quotas, credits, and guaranteed profits, had no purpose without the emergency. The moment the government stopped buying, the illusion of infinite demand vanished. The ration books were still in people's drawers, but the contracts were already expiring. Factories that had run day and night faced an impossible question. Who would buy now? The state had been their only customer. Consumers had savings but little to spend them on. The market shelves were empty because 4 years of rationing had starved production for civilians. The entire structure was built on deferred consumption, a dam holding back a flood of demand. The politicians called it reconversion. The economists called it transition. But what it really was a slow unmasking of who had won and who had merely served. Take DuPont again. By 1945, it had built over 50 new plants, all funded by the U.S. Treasury. Those plants made explosives, nylon, and synthetic fuels. When peace came, DuPont didn't demolish them. It simply retooled them for consumer goods, plastics, paints, fibers. The government had paid for the infrastructure. The shareholders would reap the profit. General Motors did the same with its tank lines, shifting to automobiles for a market starved by wartime restrictions. The first post-war car models sold out before they even left the factories. For companies, demobilization was not collapse. It was harvest. The same plants, the same machinery, now sold peace the way they had sold war. But for the public, the end of rationing revealed the hidden cost. Prices surged. Inflation between 1945 and 1947 hit double digits. Wages lagged behind. The cost-plus contracts that had guaranteed profits during the war turned into subsidies for inflation afterward. Government spending plummeted from $93 billion in 1945 to $30 billion in 1946, yet the money supply stayed bloated. The state had created an economy where withdrawal was impossible without pain. And then came the revelation. The crisis of overproduction that economists feared before the war had returned, only disguised as victory. By 1947, factories could produce more than the domestic market could absorb. The answer? Export it. The Marshall Plan, sold as generosity toward Europe, was also a mechanism to absorb American industrial surplus. Washington financed European reconstruction with American goods, paid for by American taxpayers, sold by American corporations. The war economy became the peace economy, only with new branding. The same pattern appeared in Britain. When rationing continued well into the 1950s, it wasn't because of scarcity. It was because the system had become dependent on control. The Ministry of Supply could not simply vanish. It had become an empire of bureaucracy tied to private contracts. Every ton of coal, every loaf of bread, every barrel of fuel passed through the same funnel of state procurement and corporate delivery. When people demanded freedom from rationing, they were unknowingly asking to dismantle the machinery that had kept the elites in profit and the public in line. The collapse was not dramatic. No riots, no coups, just arithmetic. The numbers stopped adding up. Governments couldn't afford both demobilization and subsidies. Citizens couldn't buy enough to replace lost state demand. Companies couldn't sustain guaranteed margins in open markets. The crisis of 1946-47, the strikes, the inflation, they weren't chaos. They were the economy rediscovering risk after 4 years of illusion. And yet, even in exposure, the system adapted. What had been called wartime mobilization found a new name: military-industrial complex. The structure survived, only its justification changed. Because once you learn how to make money from scarcity, you don't unlearn it. You just rename the war. When the war ended, the soldiers came home, but the war economy stayed. It simply changed uniforms. What had been called mobilization was renamed containment, then reconstruction, then national security. The rationing boards dissolved, yet the logic behind them, centralized control, guaranteed contracts, permanent scarcity, became the DNA of the modern economic system. Look at what followed: the Cold War, the Korean conflict, Vietnam, the oil shocks, the war on terror, the pandemic economy. Different enemies, same arithmetic. Each new crisis justified the same transfer: risk to the public, profit to the supplier. The blueprint forged during 1942 to 1945 became the invisible architecture of every subsequent boom. The Pentagon budget replaced the War Production Board. Defense contractors replaced rationing corporations. Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon. These are not new entities. They're direct descendants of the same wartime logic that made DuPont and General Motors indispensable. The state orders, the companies deliver, the taxpayer pays. And in civilian life, rationing never really ended. It was privatized. Instead of coupons, we got credit limits. Instead of government-imposed scarcity, we got corporate-engineered scarcity, subscription models, supply constraints, planned obsolescence. The illusion is freedom of choice. The reality is rationing through price and debt. The system learned to maintain control not by forbidding consumption, but by monetizing it infinitely. Consider the 1970s oil crises. The public was told it was about OPEC embargoes and global shortages, yet the profit margins of energy corporations soared. Sound familiar? A crisis redistributes purchasing power upward. When prices rise, ownership concentrates. The same pattern reappeared during the 2020 pandemic. Supply chains tightened, governments paid industries to stabilize, and a handful of corporations, Amazon, Pfizer, BlackRock, emerged with wartime-scale profits. What began as a temporary wartime mechanism has become a permanent operating system. The logic of rationing, control the flow, own the scarcity, invoice the state, rules everything from food to semiconductors. Even the rhetoric hasn't changed. In 1943, it was do with less so they'll have enough. In 2020, it was stay home to save lives. Both sincere, both exploited. The moral appeal disguises the economic transfer. The numbers tell the same story. In 1945, 10 companies controlled roughly 30% of U.S. industrial output. By 2025, a handful of conglomerates and financial institutions control over 80% of the global data, logistics, and production infrastructure. The war economy didn't die. It globalized. It detached from battlefields and attached to markets, pandemics, and carbon credits. And what about rationing itself? Today, it wears digital clothes, energy quotas, carbon allowances, central bank digital currencies with programmable limits. The mechanism that began as printed coupons in 1942 is now algorithmic. Instead of a paper book, you'll have an app. Instead of a local board, a global database. The principle is the same. Scarcity as governance. Arithmetic, again, never lies. Systems of controlled scarcity generate wealth for the few and obedience from the many. Whether it's gasoline in 1943 or data bandwidth in 2025, the pattern persists. Restriction framed as virtue, coordination framed as safety, compliance framed as solidarity. And the beneficiaries? The same class as always, those who print the permits, issue the credits, and write the rules. The industrialists of 1942 have become the asset managers of 2025. Different names, same power, owning the bottleneck. Every system begins with necessity and ends with control. What started in 1942 as a desperate measure to win a war became a template for managing populations through scarcity. The great paradox of the 20th century, and now of the 21st, is that prosperity didn't kill the rationing mentality. It perfected it. In theory, rationing was supposed to end when abundance returned. But abundance is dangerous for those who profit from limits. So, instead of abolishing scarcity, power learned to manufacture it. Not by withholding goods, but by controlling access. If you can dictate who receives energy, credit, or information, you don't need armies. You rule by permission. That's the quiet legacy of the World War II rationing economy. It taught governments and corporations that the public accepts control when it's wrapped in moral language. In 1943, it was for victory. In 2008, it was for stability. In 2020, it was for safety. The formulas change. The arithmetic doesn't. You can convince almost anyone to surrender freedom if you redefine obedience as virtue. But there's a deeper lesson, one that arithmetic itself whispers. Systems don't collapse because of conspiracies or bad intentions. They collapse when their promises outgrow reality, when coupons outnumber goods, when credit outpaces production, when trust shrinks faster than the supply of truth. That's when the equations turn against their architects. We live in another age of managed scarcity, digital, financial, psychological. You don't line up for butter or gas. You line up for access, data, visibility. The new ration books are apps and terms of service. The new OPA is the algorithm deciding what you see, what you earn, what you can afford to believe. The arithmetic will break again. It always does. Because no matter how refined the system becomes, you cannot ration trust. You can command labor, production, and consumption, but you cannot command confidence forever. And when confidence disappears, control turns to dust. If you've watched this far, remember this truth. Every temporary emergency builds a permanent structure. The question is never who imposed the rationing, but who kept it after the crisis ended. That's where empires hide. That's where wealth migrates. That's where history repeats.